A powerful CEO is committed to a psychiatric ward by his own wife, but the one nurse who refuses to follow orders is about to change everything. The room smelled like floor cleaner and something older underneath it, something that didn't wash out. Marcus Holt had noticed that on the first night when the orderly had guided him down the hallway of Lakeview Psychiatric Center with a hand that was firm enough to mean something. He had noticed it and filed it away, the way he had always filed things away. Quietly, precisely, without letting on. He had been in worse rooms. Smaller, colder, noisier. But he had never been in one he wasn't allowed to leave. The window in his room on the third floor looked north over the flat gray roofline of downtown Hamilton, Ontario. Late November. The sky hadn't decided what it wanted to do yet. Not quite snow, not quite rain. Just that particular Canadian in between that meant the cold had arrived and wasn't interested in negotiating. He stood at that window the first morning and watched a delivery truck idle at the loading dock of the building across the street for a long time. Someone jumped out, carried a box in, came back, jumped back in. Drove away. Normal. Ordinary. The smallest transaction of a normal day. He had run a company of 412 people from a corner office on King Street West. He had closed a $340 million acquisition in a hotel lobby in Vancouver with a handshake and a phone call. He had not cried at his father's funeral because someone had to stay standing. And now he was watching a delivery truck and trying to remember the last time he had done something ordinary. His name on the intake form read Marcus David Holt, 41. Chief Executive Officer, Holt Meridian Capital Group. The admitting diagnosis, as explained to him by a doctor Anand Vashti with the careful tone of a man who had rehearsed the conversation, was acute psychiatric break with dissociative features. He had been brought in 5 days ago. His wife Renata had accompanied him. She had been composed and concerned and had touched his arm in the elevator in a way that was meant to be seen by the admitting nurse. He had not had a psychiatric break. He was certain of that the way you are certain of the things you are not allowed to say out loud. What he had had was a conversation. 3 weeks earlier, in the boardroom of Holt Meridian's Markham office, he had found a set of internal transfers that didn't belong anywhere in the structure he had built. 11 transactions, staggered over 9 months, routed through a subsidiary he barely touched anymore. Small enough individually to pass beneath the automated flags, large enough collectively to matter. He had taken the documents home. He had spread them on the kitchen table after dinner and asked Renata, quietly, if she could explain why her brother's private holding company appeared in 3 of the transfer chains. The conversation had not gone well. 4 days later, he woke up in Lakeview. He had no memory of the night before admission. He remembered a glass of wine, the 11 o'clock news, a headache that came on faster than usual. He remembered nothing after that. The gap in his memory was clean and precise, like a page that had been carefully removed from a notebook. His phone was gone, his wallet, his watch, the plain steel one his father had left him, not the expensive one he wore to client meetings. Gone. He had asked about it and been told that personal items were secured for his comfort during the stabilization period. He did not argue. Not yet. He knew enough about the situation to understand that arguing would become evidence of the thing he was supposed to have. So Marcus Holt stood at the window and watched the sky over Hamilton and counted what he knew. He knew the transfers were real. He knew he had a lawyer, Patrick Osei, who had been with him since the beginning, meticulous and loyal, and sharp enough to have noticed something was wrong even before Marcus had. He did not know if Patrick had been told what happened. He did not know who had been told what happened. He did not know how long Renata intended to keep him here, or what exactly was being moved while he stood at a window watching the weather. What he did not know on that first morning was the name of the nurse on the day shift. He learned it on the 3rd day. She came in at 7 carrying a small tray and a chart and the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to move without thinking. Her name tag read, Claire Beaulieu, RN. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of tired that lives in the eyes rather than the posture. She checked his vitals the way competent people do things, not performing the task, just doing it. She didn't speak to him like he was fragile. That was the first thing he noticed. Most of the staff on the ward addressed him in that particular register of professional gentleness that is really a form of distance. Claire Beaulieu said good morning and meant it. She asked if he had slept. She adjusted the radiator without being asked because she had noticed him standing near it. On that third day, she was the only person at Lakeview Psychiatric Center who had treated him like someone who might have a reasonable opinion about the temperature in his own room. He didn't say anything. He watched. On the fifth day, he heard her in the hallway. He had been sitting near the door, a habit he had developed as a child in a house where you needed to know who was moving and where, and through the gap between the door frame and the wall, he could hear two staff members talking. One was the night supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, whose voice carried even when he was trying to lower it. The other was Claire. Families asked again about increasing the Ativan, Gerald said. A pause. He's not showing any agitation markers. There's no clinical basis for it. Families request. Families not his physician. Another pause, longer this time. Dr. Vashti signed off. I'll need to see that in writing before I adjust the chart. That was all. Footsteps moving away. But Marcus sat very still for a long time after and let that small exchange settle into the part of his mind where he kept the things that mattered. She had pushed back. He didn't know why. He didn't know if it was protocol or principle or something she hadn't even named for herself yet. But she had pushed back, and it had been quick and quiet and completely without performance, and it had cost her something. The slight tension in her voice told him that, and she had done it anyway. He started paying closer attention. On the seventh day, Claire came in for the afternoon check and found him at the small table by the window, writing in a notepad he had requested from the nurse's station. She didn't ask what he was writing. She checked his blood pressure and recorded it and set a cup of tea on the table beside him, and he looked up and she was already turning to go. "Thank you," he said. His voice had gone a little rough from disuse. "For the other day, in the hallway." She turned. The expression on her face was careful but not closed. "You heard that. The door doesn't seal properly." She looked at him for a moment. "How are you sleeping?" 4 hours. Maybe 5. He paused. "I don't have a psychiatric condition, Ms. Beaulieu." The careful look didn't change. "Okay. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just—" He stopped. "I wanted you to know I heard you, and that it mattered." She nodded once, slowly. Then she left. He stared at the notepad. He had been trying to reconstruct the 11 transactions from memory, trying to piece together what he could pull from 3 years of working with those accounts. Numbers had always been the thing his mind held most faithfully, and he had been quietly rebuilding the map of what he knew, one careful line at a time. He had not expected the conversation with Claire to go that far, and it had only gone 3 sentences. But she had said okay in a way that meant she was listening, and that was more than anyone else in the building had offered him. Over the next week, a routine formed. Not the routine the ward expected, the medication schedule, the group sessions, the hourly check-ins, but something quieter running beneath it. Claire worked 3-day shifts and 2 nights per week. On her night shifts, the ward became very still around 11, and she would sometimes stop outside his room longer than necessary on her rounds. On the 11th night, she opened the door slightly and said, "You're awake." "I'm always awake." She came in, left the door open behind her. She stood near the window instead of sitting, looking out at the city for a moment before she spoke. "Your wife was here this afternoon while you were in group." He kept his voice even. "What did she want?" "She spoke with Dr. Vashti for about 40 minutes. I only caught the end of it. She said something about a voluntary long-term care agreement, that you'd be more comfortable at a residential facility outside the city." He set the notepad down. "There's no such agreement." "No, not yet." Claire turned from the window. She brought a man with her, not a doctor. He was carrying a document folder. "He wasn't introduced to me." She paused. "I have a colleague who recognized him. He's a lawyer who works primarily on estates and corporate trusts." The room was very quiet. Marcus thought about Renata in the boardroom of a law office somewhere across the city. He thought about the 11 transfers. He thought about the gap where his memory should have been. "How long can they hold me here without a formal review?" he asked. "Involuntary status requires a board review within 30 days of admission. You're at day 11. If they move you to a residential facility before the review, then the clock resets. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. He looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Claire was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the floor, then back at him, and when she spoke, her voice was lower than usual but steady. I've worked psych for 9 years. I've seen a lot of things I should have questioned earlier than I did. She paused. I grew up watching my dad get talked over by people with better suits. He had a union dispute that should have taken 3 months and took 3 years because nobody would write anything down. She stopped. I'm not saying I know what's happening here, but I know the difference between someone who's struggling and someone who's been placed. The word landed quietly in the room between them. Placed. He hadn't said it to himself in quite that way. He had been working around it, approaching it from angles, but hearing it said plainly by someone else did something to the shape of it. I need to get a message to my lawyer, he said. Your personal phone was removed at intake. I know. He looked at the notepad. If I wrote something out, something specific enough that it would mean something to him and nothing to anyone else, is there any way? Claire looked at him for a long time. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Not cold calculation, the other kind. The kind that includes the cost to yourself. I have a break at 6:15, she said finally. I sometimes make personal calls from the parking structure. She left without saying anything else. He stayed up the rest of the night writing. He wrote carefully the way Patrick would need it. Reference numbers, account codes, the names of 3 subsidiaries, the dates of the 11 transactions as best he could reconstruct them. He kept it compact, less than a page, dense and specific and legible only to someone who already knew the architecture of Holt Meridian's financial structure. At the bottom he wrote, I am being held at Lakeview Psychiatric Hamilton. I am not impaired. Do not contact Renata. Do not contact anyone at the firm except Yolanda in legal. Come yourself. He folded the paper small and held it for a while before he let go of it. When Claire came in for the 6 o'clock check, he passed it to her under the edge of the notepad in a motion that looked like nothing. Her hand closed over it without pause, as though she'd been expecting it. She left. He sat at the window and watched the dark parking structure across the way, and at 6:22 he saw a light flicker briefly on the second level. A phone screen. A number being dialed. He breathed out slowly. He did not allow himself to feel too much about it yet. Over the days that followed, Claire moved carefully. She never spoke to him differently in front of other staff. She did not change her charting. She brought his tea, checked his vitals, treated him with the professional consistency that would register as routine to anyone watching. But in the small hours when the ward was down to skeleton crew and the hallway lights had been dimmed for the night, she would find a reason to stop outside his door. She told him things in the way she said them. A mention that Dr. Vashti had been unusually unavailable that week. An observation that someone from administration had been reviewing intake records. A quiet note that the lock on the records room had been changed. He listened and added each thing to the reconstruction he was building in his head. She told him other things too, not about the ward. Small things, the way people do when they've stopped pretending a conversation isn't happening. She told him she had taken the night rotation because the pay differential helped her finish paying back her student loans, and that she kept a list of the patients she remembered on a note card in her locker because she needed to remember that the job was about people, not throughput. He told her about his father, a sheet metal worker from Brantford who had read the business section of the newspaper every day of his life and never had an occasion to use it. He told her his father had believed, with complete sincerity, that if you were honest in your work, it would come back to you. He said he had spent 20 years in finance and had mostly found this to be untrue, but that he had never quite been able to stop believing it either. She laughed at that, a small, real quiet laugh, and the sound of it in the stillness of the ward at 1 in the morning was startling in the best way. He noticed that he was thinking about what he would say to her before she arrived for her shifts. He noticed this and set it aside. On the 19th day, things moved faster than he'd expected. Claire came in early before her shift officially started, still in her coat. She closed the door. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, and the expression on her face was the kind that carries news. Patrick Osei called the patient advocacy line this morning, she said. He identified himself as your legal representative and requested an emergency status review. Dr. Vashti declined to take the call. The call was logged. She paused. An hour after the call was logged, I was pulled into a meeting with the charge supervisor. I was told that my shift assignment was being reviewed and that there were concerns about my professional boundaries. Marcus was quiet. "They're going to move me off your unit," she said. "Probably by end of week." "Claire." He said her name clearly for the first time. "I need you to hear me. Don't do anything that puts your license at risk." She shook her head. I kept a second log from the first week. Everything I observed, every conversation I heard, every medication instruction I thought was off, dated and signed. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and set a folded envelope on the table. "That's a copy. Keep it with the notepad." He looked at the envelope for a long moment. "You've been doing this from the beginning." "I started it after the Ativan conversation with Gerald." She picked up her bag. "I'm sending the original to the College of Nurses and to a patient rights advocate I know in Toronto. I'm also sending it to Patrick Osei. Your lawyer has already filed an emergency application for a capacity assessment with a physician of your choosing." She paused. "There's going to be noise. It's going to be uncomfortable." "I'm already uncomfortable." She almost smiled. "Yeah." She looked at him. "I have to go. But I wanted you to know before the shift changes." "Claire." She had her hand on the door. "Thank you." She turned and looked at him once, fully, the way people rarely do. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Get well first." She left. He sat with the envelope in his hands and the thin winter light coming through the north window, and thought about his father reading the business section in Brantford, believing in the return of honest work. 4 days later, a doctor he had never seen before came to conduct a formal psychiatric assessment, accompanied by a representative from the Ontario Patient Rights Advisory Office. The assessment took 2 hours. He answered every question clearly and directly. He asked that his responses be recorded. The doctor asked him to describe in his own words the events leading up to his admission, and he did, including the kitchen table, the financial documents, the glass of wine, and the gap. The doctor wrote for a long time. On the 24th day of his admission, Marcus Holt walked out of Lakeview Psychiatric Center in the same clothes he had arrived in because his bag hadn't been returned yet. Patrick Osei was waiting in a black sedan outside with a coffee and a folder of documents and the expression of someone who had been operating on very little sleep for 2 weeks. Marcus got in the car. The heater was running. Outside, Hamilton's late November was gray and cold and fully itself. "Renata," he said. "She's been advised not to leave the province. Her brother's company has been frozen pending forensic accounting." Patrick passed him the coffee. "It's going to be complicated before it gets clean." "Complicated I can manage." "I know." Patrick glanced at him. "You look like hell." "I'm fine." He meant it. The car pulled out of the parking lot. Marcus held the coffee and looked out at the city and didn't try to think about everything at once. There would be time for the rest of it. The transfers, the accounts, the long work of reclaiming what he had built. Right now he was just outside in ordinary cold air, which was not a small thing. He had not asked Patrick about Claire. He was being careful not to. He had told himself this was the right instinct. She had her own situation to navigate, her own professional fallout from the choices she had made, and the last thing she needed was a client who confused gratitude with something more than that. He was not entirely sure he was succeeding. 3 weeks after his discharge, Patrick called to tell him that the College of Nurses had reviewed the log Claire had submitted and found that the care concerns she had documented were substantiated. The investigation into Lakeview's admitting practices was being escalated. Dr. Hurd, Vashti, had been removed from patient care pending the review. The hospital's administration had issued a statement that was the exact texture of an institution hoping the story would stop moving. It did not stop moving. Marcus was back at the office by then in a temporary arrangement while the board processed the scope of what had happened. His assistant, Yolanda, had held the company together with the particular combination of loyalty and competence that he had never adequately acknowledged, and the first thing he did was sit with her for 40 minutes and listen to everything she had managed in his absence without being asked. He made some calls. One of them was to the director of a patient rights organization in Toronto, to arrange a conversation about funding. He was thinking about what a legal defense fund for healthcare whistleblowers might look like if it were run properly. He was thinking about the log Claire had kept, the consistency of it, the detail. He called her on a Thursday evening. He had gotten the number from Patrick, who had gotten it from the advocacy office, and he had spent 2 days deciding whether to use it. He dialed before he finished deciding. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello?" "It's Marcus Holt." He paused. "I hope this is all right." "A beat. I heard you were back at work." 3 weeks now. He was standing at the window of his office on King Street West, looking at the city, fully dark at 5 in the afternoon because that is what December in Ontario is. I've been trying to figure out what the right thing to say is." "You don't have to say anything." "I know. That's not why I'm calling." He paused. "I'm setting up a fund for patient advocates and whistleblowers in healthcare settings. The legal exposure that people take on when they do what you did is significant, and most of them don't have the resources to protect themselves." Silence on the line. Then, "That's a good idea. I'd like you to be involved in designing it if you're willing. Not as an employee. As someone who knows what the gaps actually look like from the inside." He stopped. "I'd also like to take you to dinner. Those are 2 separate things. I want to be clear about that." Another silence, longer this time. "I'm back in the ER," she said. "Hamilton General started Monday. The hours are terrible." "I know. I looked you up." He caught himself. "That sounds worse than I meant it to." She laughed. The same real small laugh he had heard at 1 in the morning in a psychiatric ward, and it moved through him in a way he hadn't braced for. "Thursday," she said. "I'm off Thursday." They met at a restaurant on James Street North that was exactly the right amount of ordinary white walls, paper menus, good wine list, no occasion required. He arrived first and sat facing the door because that was still a habit, and when she came in from the cold in a dark coat with her hair down for the first time, he understood that he had been carrying the memory of her more precisely than he had acknowledged to himself. She sat down. She looked at the menu. She looked up at him. "You look better than the last time I saw you," she said. "Lower bar." She smiled, significantly. They talked for 3 hours. About Lakeview, about the investigation, about the strange texture of the months that had passed, about his father and her father, 2 working men from different cities who had believed in similar things, about what it felt like to be placed, and what it felt like to refuse to participate in someone being placed, about the fund and what it could do if it were built right, about other things eventually, smaller things, what she had been reading, what he had been avoiding reading, a conversation about the specific misery of Hamilton winters that became, somehow, unexpectedly funny. At the end of the night, standing outside on the sidewalk while a light snow finally made its decision and came down, she looked at him and said, "I need you to know something." He waited. "What I did at Lakeview, I didn't do it for you specifically. I did it because it was the right thing, and because I spent too long in situations where I didn't do the right thing, and I know what that costs." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you this because I don't want you to think you owe me something." He looked at her for a moment. "I know that," he said. "I knew that from the beginning. It's part of why." He stopped. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "It's part of why I called you," he said. "Not all of it." But enough for now, and she seemed to understand that, and the snow came down around them on James Street, and he did not look away. He had run a company of 412 people. He had closed deals in hotel lobbies and sat through his father's funeral without moving and woken up in a room he wasn't allowed to leave. He had counted what he knew and waited and held on. The thing he knew now, standing on that sidewalk, was straightforward. He had walked into the worst period of his life, and someone had sat down beside him and chosen, without being asked, to see him clearly, not the CEO, not the name on the documents, Just a man at the window watching a delivery truck in the gray Hamilton morning, trying to hold on to what was real. That was not a small thing. 1 year later, the Holt Beridian case had moved through 2 separate legal proceedings and a provincial regulatory review. Renata and her brother had both faced charges. The forensic accountants had found not 11 transactions, but 19. The civil case was ongoing. His lawyers were patient, and Patrick Osei was in his element, and Marcus had learned to let the process take its own time. He had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the company and had not, to his surprise, experienced this as a loss. There were things he had built that would outlast the version of himself who had built them, and he was learning to find that adequate, sometimes more than adequate. The Ball U Holt Patient Advocacy Fund. Claire had resisted the name for a full month before accepting it under protest, had its first 2 cases resolved in the spring. 1 nurse in Barrie, 1 orderly in Sudbury. Both had documented concerns about patient care, and both had faced professional retaliation. The fund had covered their legal representation and engaged a communications team when the stories became public. Both were still employed. He and Claire had driven to Barrie for the first resolution hearing in April. It had been a long drive, still cold, and they had listened to the same radio station for 2 hours without changing it because neither of them wanted to be the one to say they didn't like it. They had gotten coffee from a drive-through somewhere north of Baroda, and she had spilled a small amount on her coat, and he had found this unreasonably endearing, which was how he knew, very clearly, where things stood. He had not rushed it, neither had she. They had the kind of relationship that builds in the margins of real life, in phone calls between her ER shifts and his board meetings, in Sunday mornings at his apartment or hers, in the slow accumulation of ordinary days. He was not by nature someone who made room for ordinary days. He was learning. On a Saturday in October, in the small backyard of a house in the east end of Hamilton that Claire had been renovating since she bought it 3 years earlier, with the leaves coming down and a neighbor's dog periodically visible above the fence line, Marcus told her that he loved her in the specific and considered way that he did most things, which meant he had thought about it for a long time and had only said it when he was certain it was the truest available sentence. She had been painting the fence. She turned around. There was a paintbrush in her hand. She said, "I know." She said it the way people say things they have been carrying for a while. "I've known for a long time." He had not been expecting that, and his expression apparently showed it, because she laughed, the same laugh he had first heard in a room he wasn't allowed to leave, the laugh that had moved through him like light through a window in November, when you hadn't expected any light. "You could have said something," he said. "You are still working it out." She turned back to the fence. "I thought I'd give you the time." He stood in the October backyard with the leaves coming down and thought about his father, who had believed that honest work came back to you. He had spent 20 years in finance finding this to be untrue, and then he had spent 24 days in a locked ward in Hamilton finding out it was the truest thing he knew. Some things take the long way around to arrive. Some things have to be lost before they can be found properly. And sometimes the person who changes the entire shape of your life is someone who sat down beside you in the dark and chose, without audience or reward, to see you clearly. He picked up a second brush from the tray on the ground, dipped it, started on the section of fence beside her. She glanced over. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. They painted the fence in the October afternoon, and the leaves came down, and the neighbor's dog watched them from above the fence line with the mild philosophical interest of a creature who has seen most things and found them acceptable, and the city of Hamilton went on around them, gray and ordinary and entirely itself, which was, Marcus Holt had learned, more than enough. I keep thinking about the moment Marcus stood at that north-facing window, watching a delivery truck do something completely ordinary, and understanding that ordinary was no longer something he could take for granted. That image stays with me. Not the boardroom confrontation, not the legal victory. Just a man watching a truck and counting what he still knew to be true. There's something in that I recognize. The moments that actually change us rarely look like turning points from the inside. They look like a window, a cup of tea set down without ceremony, someone choosing, quietly and without audience, to write things down honestly. What Claire did wasn't dramatic. That's the part I think gets missed when we talk about courage. She didn't expose anything in a single bold gesture. She kept a second log. She pushed back on one medication instruction in a hallway. She made a phone call from a parking structure at 6 in the morning. Small, consistent, documented acts of paying attention, and that's what integrity actually looks like when it isn't performing for anyone. It's not a speech. It's a record kept in your own handwriting because you need to be able to look at yourself at the end of the shift. Marcus had spent 20 years building something real through genuine competence, and the system nearly swallowed him whole anyway. That's the hard truth the story doesn't soften. Being capable and honest doesn't protect you automatically. What it does is give you something to hold on to when the floor drops out, a clear account of what actually happened, a foundation that can't be revised because you built it from facts. His mind held the numbers. Patrick held the legal ground. Claire held the record, and together those three forms of rigor were enough. I think about what it costs to stay sharp under that kind of pressure, to be in a locked ward for 24 days and not let panic dissolve the one thing you have left, which is your own clear account of events. That's not stubbornness. That's a trained mind refusing to abandon itself. There's a discipline in that I find genuinely worth sitting with. The idea that clarity, maintained under duress, is its own form of strength. Not louder than fear, just more consistent. And then there's the year that follows in the story, which I think is actually the most important part. Marcus doesn't rebuild by returning to exactly what he was. He steps back. He starts something new that is specifically designed to protect the people who do what Claire did, because he understood that what saved him was not a system. It was one person who hadn't yet given up on the idea that her job meant something. He chose to make that mean something back. That's the exchange I keep returning to. Not the legal outcome, not the sentencing. The fence in October. Two people painting something ordinary together after everything. I don't think the story is really about betrayal in the end. Betrayal is just the catalyst. The story is about what holds when everything else is taken. Whether what you've built in yourself is solid enough to carry you through the time when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. Honesty that only shows up when it's easy isn't really honesty. Persistence that only lasts as long as it's comfortable isn't really persistence. And care that requires an audience isn't really care. Marcus and Claire both knew that. They just had to find each other to prove it.